The 18th of July in the year 452 after the birth of Christ, the northern Italian city of Aquileia. A woman named Aurelia Marcella crouches in the darkness of a wine cellar beneath what was once the grandest villa in the merchant's quarter. She is 34 years old, the wife of Tribune Gaius Petronius Marcellus, who commands what remains of the garrison defending the city walls above her head. She has not seen her husband in 11 days. The last time she saw him, he kissed her forehead and told her to hide the children. He told her that if the walls fell, she should take them to the lagoons to the east. He told her that whatever happened, she must not let the Huns take her alive. Above her head, the sound of screaming has not stopped for 3 hours. Aurelia holds her 2 daughters against her chest. Flavia is 12. Tertia is 9. They stopped crying 2 days ago when the food ran out. Now they simply shake. The cellar smells of old wine and mold and something else, something that has been drifting through the streets for days. The smell of burning flesh and rotting bodies that even the thick stone walls cannot keep out. What Aurelia does not know yet is that her husband died on the walls 6 hours ago. An arrow through his throat while he directed the defense of the eastern gate. What she does not know is that the Huns breached the walls at dawn through a section that collapsed after 3 months of relentless bombardment. What she does not know is that the warriors now moving through the streets above her head are not simply looting. They are hunting. And what Aurelia Marcella absolutely does not know is what the Huns do to the wives of Roman military commanders. She does not know that there is a specific protocol, a system that has been refined over decades of conquest across the steppes and into the heart of Europe. She does not know that wives of officers are identified and separated from the general population. She does not know that what happens to them next is designed not merely to punish, but to send a message that will echo across the empire for generations. She is about to find out. The footsteps above grow closer. Aurelia hears voices speaking a language she does not understand, harsh guttural sounds that seem barely human. She hears the crash of doors being broken down. She hears the screams of neighbors she has known for years. She smells smoke from buildings that are beginning to burn. And then she hears footsteps on the stairs leading down to the cellar. Tonight, you will discover the systematic practices that the Huns employed against the families of Roman military leadership. Practices that ancient historians recorded in fragments too disturbing for most modern textbooks to include. You will learn why the wives of Roman generals and tribunes were specifically targeted and what purpose their suffering served in the broader strategy of Hunnic conquest. You will understand why the Byzantine historian Priscus, who actually visited the court of the Hun king and saw these practices firsthand, wrote that the treatment of captive Roman noblewomen was designed to break not just bodies, but entire bloodlines. And you will learn what archaeological evidence discovered in mass graves across the Balkans reveals about the scale of what happened to thousands of Roman women whose only crime was being married to men who defended the empire. If you find this content valuable, please consider subscribing to the channel. We explore the darkest corners of history that mainstream sources refuse to discuss. But before I tell you exactly what happened in that cellar beneath Aquileia, before I reveal what the Huns did to Aurelia Marcella and her daughters when they finally broke through the door, I need to take you back. I need to explain how the most feared warriors in the ancient world developed their particular methods for dealing with the wives of their enemies. Because understanding what happened in Aquileia requires understanding the system that created it. And I promise you that by the time we return to that cellar, you will understand exactly why Aurelia's husband told her that death was preferable to capture. Let me tell you about another woman first. Her name was Licinia Eudoxia. She was not a victim of the Huns, but her story illustrates what Roman women faced during this era of collapse. She was the daughter of the Eastern Roman Emperor Theodosius II, and she was married to the Western Emperor Valentinian III. When Valentinian was assassinated in 455, she was taken as a prize by Vandal raiders who sacked Rome itself. She spent years in captivity before being released. Her story was famous. It was discussed in the courts of Constantinople, but the thousands of women taken by the Huns, their stories were not famous. Their stories were not discussed. They simply disappeared into the vastness of the steppes and were never heard from again. The Huns emerged from the Central Asian steppes sometime in the 4th century after the birth of Christ. Their origins remain disputed among historians, but what is not disputed is the terror they inspired from the moment they crossed into Europe. The Roman historian Ammianus Marcellinus, writing in the 370s, described them as a race of men who surpassed all other barbarians in their savagery. He wrote that they were short and squat with massive shoulders and thick necks. that their faces were so hideous and beardless that they might be mistaken for two-legged beasts rather than human beings. But Ammianus was describing more than physical appearance. He was describing a culture of warfare that the Romans had never encountered. The Huns were nomadic horse warriors who lived in the saddle from childhood. They could shoot their composite bows with deadly accuracy while riding at full gallop. They ate raw meat that they tenderized by placing it between their thighs and their horses' flanks. They had no permanent settlements and no written language. And most importantly for our story, they had developed sophisticated methods for extracting maximum value from conquered peoples. This is where the wives of military commanders become relevant. But first, you need to understand something about Hunnic society that most histories do not emphasize. The Huns were not simply raiders, they were empire builders. By the time of Attila, they controlled territory stretching from the Rhine River in the west to the Ural Mountains in the east. They ruled over dozens of subject peoples, including Goths, Gepids, Alans, and remnants of earlier nomadic confederations. They extracted tribute from both the Eastern and Western Roman empires. At the height of their power, they received 2,100 pounds of gold annually from Constantinople alone. An empire of this scale required more than military force. It required systems. Systems for extracting wealth, systems for controlling subject populations, systems for breaking the will of conquered peoples so completely that rebellion became unthinkable. The treatment of captured women was part of this system. Among nomadic warrior cultures like the Huns, women of the enemy leadership class served multiple purposes. They were trophies that demonstrated victory. They were hostages whose treatment could be used to demoralize remaining resistance. They were breeding stock whose children would carry the bloodline of the conquerors. And they were objects of trade whose value depended on their social status and physical condition. The Byzantine historian Priscus provides the most detailed first-hand account of Hunnic society. In the year 449, he traveled to the court of the Hun king as part of a diplomatic mission from Constantinople. What he saw there changed his understanding of the barbarian world forever. Priscus describes meeting a Greek merchant who had been captured during the sack of the city of Viminatium on the Danube. This merchant had been wealthy before his capture. He had been assigned to a Hun noble named Onegesius as part of the division of spoils. Priscus notes that among the Huns it was customary for wealthy captives to be given to the nobility, while common prisoners were distributed among the warriors or sold as slaves. But Priscus also describes something more disturbing. He writes about the way Hun elites treated their slaves and captives. He notes that unlike Roman masters who were legally prohibited from killing their slaves without cause, the Huns had no such restrictions. Hun nobles could and did execute captives for minor offenses or simply for entertainment. They could and did use female captives in whatever manner they chose. Priscus records a conversation he had with the Greek merchant about the differences between Roman and Hunnic slavery. The merchant who had adapted to life among the Huns initially argued that captives were treated better than poor citizens of the Roman Empire. He claimed that Hun masters were more generous than Roman tax collectors. He claimed that life on the steppes had a freedom that life in the declining empire could not match. But when Priscus pressed him, the merchant admitted certain truths. He admitted that Hun masters could kill their slaves without consequence. He admitted that female captives had no legal protections whatsoever. He admitted that the children of captive women belonged entirely to their masters with no recognition of Roman paternity or citizenship. And then the merchant wept. He wept because despite his accommodation to Hunnic life, he knew what had happened to the Roman women he had seen taken during the sack of Viminatium. He knew what had happened to their children. He knew that the fate of captive noblewomen was something he could not speak of even after years among the Huns. The treatment of elite Roman women was particularly brutal because it served a strategic purpose. The Huns understood something fundamental about Roman society. Roman military commanders drew their authority not just from their office, but from their family name and lineage. A tribune or general whose wife and daughters had been violated and enslaved lost not just his family, but his honor. His ability to command respect among his peers was destroyed. His bloodline was corrupted. This was intentional. The first major Hun invasion of Roman territory came in the year 441, when the kings Attila and Bleda launched a massive assault across the Danube into the provinces of Illyricum. The Eastern Roman Empire had sent its best troops to North Africa to fight the Vandals, leaving the Danubian frontier virtually undefended. The Huns recognized this weakness and exploited it with devastating efficiency. The invasion was not a simple raid. It was a calculated campaign designed to extract maximum concessions from the Eastern Empire. Attila and Bleda used the pretext of unpaid tribute and unfulfilled treaty obligations to justify their attack. They claimed that Roman authorities were harboring Hunnic deserters. They claimed that a Roman bishop had desecrated Hunnic burial sites. Whether these claims were true was irrelevant. They provided the justification for an assault that had been planned for months. They captured and destroyed the city of Singidunum, which is now Belgrade. The garrison there numbered approximately 3,000 men. None survived. The civilian population numbered perhaps 15,000. Those who were not killed were taken as slaves. The families of the garrison officers were separated and processed according to the Hunnic system. They moved on to Margus and razed it to the ground. The bishop of Margus, the very man the Huns had accused of tomb desecration, was handed over to them by his own congregation, who hoped this sacrifice might spare their city. It did not. Margus was destroyed as thoroughly as Singidunum. The bishop's fate was recorded in fragments that suggest he was impaled on the walls of his own cathedral. They drove deep into the Balkans, taking city after city, and at each conquest they followed the same pattern. The fighting men were killed or enslaved. The common women and children were taken as general captives to be distributed among the warriors, but the wives and daughters of military officers and civic leaders were separated and given special treatment. The city of Naissus provides the most horrifying example of this system in action. Naissus was the birthplace of Constantine the Great, the emperor who had legalized Christianity and transformed the Roman world. It was a major military center and administrative hub in the province of Dacia Mediterranea. The city had walls that had been strengthened under multiple emperors. It had granaries that could sustain a siege for months. It had a garrison of veteran troops and a civilian militia prepared to defend their homes. When the Huns arrived in 443, they found a city that would not surrender. The siege began in early spring. The Huns deployed battering rams and siege towers technologies they had learned from conquered peoples over decades of expansion. They also deployed a weapon that the Romans had not anticipated: terror. Every day of the siege, the Huns executed captives taken from the surrounding countryside within sight of the walls. They impaled farmers. They burned villages. They sent the severed heads of Roman soldiers flying over the walls by catapult. They wanted the defenders to know exactly what awaited them if they did not surrender. The defenders did not surrender. They held for weeks as their food supplies dwindled and disease began to spread. They held as the Huns brought up more siege equipment and began systematic bombardment of the walls. They held until they could hold no longer. When the walls finally fell, the Huns unleashed what the historian Callinicus called a slaughter beyond counting. The same Callinicus wrote that the barbarian nation of the Huns, which was in Thrace, became so great that more than 100 cities were captured, and there were so many murders and bloodlettings that the dead could not be numbered. He wrote that they took captive the churches and monasteries and slew the monks and maidens in great quantities. But what happened to the families of the officers who defended Naissus was recorded in fragments that survive only because later historians found them too significant to ignore entirely. The commander of the Naissus garrison was a man whose name has been lost to history. We know him only as the Comus Nicenis, the Count of Naissus. We know that his wife was captured alive along with their 3 daughters whose ages are recorded as 14, 11, and 8. We know that they were identified by servants who betrayed their hiding place in exchange for their own lives. What happened next was documented by Priscus, who passed through the ruins of Naissus 5 years after its destruction. He wrote that when they arrived at Naissus, they found the city deserted, as though it had been sacked. Only a few sick persons lay in the churches. He wrote that they halted at a short distance from the river in an open space because all the ground adjacent to the bank was full of the bones of men slain in war. But Priscus also recorded testimony from survivors who had witnessed the fate of the commander's family. The wife of the Comes was brought before the Hun nobles who had led the assault. She was stripped of her Roman clothing, which was valuable and could be sold or traded. She was examined by Hun women who served as assessors, determining the value of female captives based on age, appearance, and potential uses. She was then assigned to a warrior whose rank entitled him to a captive of her status. Her daughters were separated from her and assigned to different warriors based on their ages and potential value. The oldest at 14 was considered of breeding age. The youngest at 8 was considered trainable for domestic service. The middle daughter presented a different set of possibilities. What the sources describe next I must convey carefully because the details are disturbing even by the standards of ancient warfare. Roman noblewomen captured by the Huns were subjected to a process designed to break their identity completely. They were given Hunnic names. They were forced to adopt Hunnic dress and customs. They were prevented from speaking Latin or Greek on pain of severe punishment. They were required to serve their captors in whatever capacity was demanded. For the wives of military commanders, this process was particularly brutal, because the Huns wanted to ensure that these women could never return to Roman society. A woman who had been captured and enslaved might theoretically be ransomed or rescued, but a woman who had been used in certain ways could never reclaim her former status. Roman law and custom were clear on this point. A woman who had been violated by barbarians was considered permanently polluted. Her testimony in court was worthless. Her children, if she had any after such treatment, were considered illegitimate. Her husband, if he survived, was legally entitled to divorce her without penalty. The Huns knew this. They exploited it deliberately. The wife of the Comes Nicenes was not ransomed despite attempts by relatives to negotiate her release. The Hun noble who held her refused all offers. 5 years later, when Priscus passed through the region, she was still alive. She was still in captivity. She was no longer recognizable as a Roman noblewoman. She had been transformed into something else entirely. Her daughters were never seen again by any Roman witness. But Naissus was only the beginning. In the year 452, the Huns under Attila launched their greatest assault on the Western Roman Empire. They crossed the Julian Alps into Italy itself. Their first target was Aquileia, the great fortress city that guarded the northern approaches to the Italian peninsula. Aquileia was one of the most important cities in the Western Empire. It served as the seat of an imperial residence, a major commercial hub, and a critical military stronghold. Its walls had been strengthened over centuries. Its garrison was substantial. The Roman general Flavius Aetius had reinforced it with his best troops, knowing that if Aquileia held, the Huns would be forced into a costly siege that might exhaust their resources. Aetius was right about the siege. It lasted 3 months. The Huns surrounded the city and bombarded it relentlessly. They cut off food supplies. They contaminated water sources by throwing bodies into the rivers upstream. They launched assault after assault against the walls, each one repelled with heavy casualties on both sides. But Aetius was wrong about one thing. He believed that the walls would hold until he could gather a relief force. They did not. According to the historian Jordanes, who wrote a century later, Attila was on the verge of abandoning the siege when he observed a white stork flying away from the city with its young. He interpreted this as a sign that the city was doomed. The next day, a section of wall that had been weakened by months of bombardment finally collapsed. The Huns poured through the breach. What followed was one of the most complete destructions of a major Roman city in history. Jordanes writes that the Huns so devastated Aquileia that they barely left traces of it remaining. They did not simply loot the city. They systematically dismantled it. They tore down buildings. They burned what could not be torn down. They melted gold and silver religious objects in furnaces built from the rubble of churches. They took everything of value that could be carried and destroyed everything that could not. But the people were the real prize. The population of Aquileia before the siege was estimated at over 50,000. Some had fled before the siege began. Some had died during the 3 months of bombardment and starvation. When the walls fell, perhaps 30,000 remained. The Huns separated them according to the same system they had perfected across the Balkans. Fighting men were killed unless they had valuable skills. Craftsmen were enslaved and sent back to Hunnic territory. Common women and children were distributed among the warriors or sold to slave traders who followed the army. And the families of military officers and civic leaders were identified, separated, and subjected to the special treatment reserved for their class. Now we return to that cellar. Aurelia Marcella and her daughters were discovered on the 2nd day after the walls fell. They were betrayed by a household slave who hoped to earn favor with the conquerors. The Hun warriors who found them did not kill them immediately. They recognized from Aurelia's clothing and jewelry that she was a woman of status. They sent for an assessor. The assessor was a Hun woman whose job was to evaluate female captives. She examined Aurelia and her daughters, noting their ages, their physical condition, their potential uses. She asked through an interpreter whether Aurelia's husband was alive. When Aurelia said she did not know, the assessor smiled. If the husband was alive and could be identified, then Aurelia and her daughters would be used to break him. They would be displayed to him before he was executed so that his last sight would be their humiliation. This was standard practice for the families of officers who had led resistance against the Huns. If the husband was already dead, then Aurelia and her daughters would be distributed according to their value. Aurelia herself, at 34, was considered past her prime breeding years, but still useful for domestic service and other purposes. Flavia at 12 was considered of breeding age. Tertia at 9 was considered trainable. Aurelia learned that her husband had died on the walls. She received this news not as grief, but as a strange kind of relief. At least he would not have to witness what came next. What came next was the journey. Captured women were not kept at the site of conquest. They were marched back to Hunnic territory across hundreds of miles of increasingly hostile terrain. This journey served multiple purposes. It removed the captives from any possibility of rescue. It broke their will through exhaustion and deprivation. And it killed the weakest, ensuring that only the most valuable survived to reach the slave markets. The march from Aquileia to the Hungarian plain covered approximately 500 miles. It crossed the Julian Alps through mountain passes that rose to elevations of over 5,000 feet. It crossed rivers swollen with spring melt. It passed through territories that had already been ravaged by the Hunnic advance, where no food or shelter could be found. Aurelia and her daughters marched for 6 weeks. They were given barely enough food to survive, a handful of grain each day, occasionally a piece of dried meat from horses that had died on the march, water from streams and rivers, some of which had been contaminated by the bodies of those who had died before them. They were not given adequate clothing for the mountain crossings. Aurelia's fine Roman clothing had been stripped from her on the first day. She was given a rough wool tunic that provided little warmth in the mountain cold. Her daughters were given nothing at all until other captives died and their clothing could be redistributed. They were forced to walk barefoot over rocky ground. The Huns had no interest in providing shoes to captives. Shoes were valuable. Captive women were renewable. They were beaten if they fell behind. The Huns had no patience for weakness. A captive who could not keep up was a captive who would slow the march, and a captive who slowed the march was a captive who would be left behind to die. Many women died on these marches. The bodies were left where they fell. The Huns did not bury their captives. They did not mark the graves. They did not pause to say prayers for the dead. They simply moved on. Aurelia survived. She survived because she was strong, because she had been well fed before the siege, because she forced herself to keep moving when every part of her body screamed for rest. Flavia survived. She survived because she was young, because her body could endure what an older woman's body could not, because her mother pushed her forward step after step through the mountain passes. Tertia did not survive. Tertia died on the 3rd week of the march. She was 9 years old. She died of exhaustion and exposure in the Julian Alps, somewhere between Aquileia and the Hunnic heartland. She died calling for her mother. She died asking why this was happening to her. She died without understanding what she had done to deserve this fate. Her body was left beside the road. Aurelia was not allowed to stop walking. When the survivors reached Hunnic territory, they were brought to a central gathering point where the spoils of the Italian campaign were sorted and distributed. The historian Priscus describes similar scenes from his visit to Attila's court. He writes about seeing Roman captives of obvious noble birth serving as slaves to Hun warriors. He writes about the way they had been transformed by their captivity. He writes about women who no longer remembered their own names, who no longer remembered their families, who had been broken so completely that they could not imagine any life other than the one they now lived. Aurelia and Flavia were separated at this point. They were assigned to different Hun nobles and would never see each other again. A mother who had lost one daughter on the march now lost another to the distribution of spoils. She had no say in the matter. She had no rights. She was property now, and property does not have opinions about how it is divided. The last words Aurelia spoke to Flavia were recorded by no one. The last embrace they shared was witnessed by no one who cared to remember. The last moment a Roman noblewoman and her daughter stood together as free human beings ended in a distribution yard somewhere on the Hungarian plain, and then they were gone from each other forever. The records of what happened to them individually do not survive. We know only that they were among the thousands of Roman women who disappeared into the vastness of the Hunnic Empire, never to return. We know only that their fate was shared by women from every city the Huns destroyed, from Singidunum and Margus and Naissus, from Serdica and Philippopolis, from Aquileia and Padua and Milan, and 100 other places whose names have been forgotten. But we know what generally happened to women in their situation because the patterns were consistent across decades of Hunnic conquest. Women assigned to Hun warriors became their property in every sense of the word. They were expected to perform domestic labor, to serve meals, to maintain clothing and equipment. They were expected to provide physical services as demanded. They were expected to bear children who would be raised as Huns, not as Romans. If they resisted, they were beaten. If they tried to escape, they were killed or mutilated in ways that made future escape impossible. If they refused to submit to their captors, they were passed to less prestigious warriors whose treatment was even harsher. Some Roman women captured by the Huns eventually achieved a kind of accommodation with their circumstances. Priscus describes meeting one such woman at Attila's court. She had been captured during the sack of Viminacium years earlier. She had been given to a Hun noble named Onagesius as part of his share of the spoils. She had borne him children. She was no longer kept as a slave, but as something like a secondary wife. She had adapted to Hun customs so completely that she no longer spoke Greek or Latin. Priscus describes this woman with a mixture of fascination and horror. He notes that she dressed in Hunnic fashion, that she wore her hair in the Hunnic style, that she sat on the floor among the Hun women and embroidered cloth as they did. He notes that when he addressed her in Greek, she initially did not respond, as though she had forgotten the language of her birth. Only when he persisted did she finally speak to him in halting phrases that suggested years of disuse. She told him that her Roman name no longer mattered. She told him that her children knew nothing of Rome. She told him that she had been fortunate to be given to Onagesius, who was wealthy and treated his women well by Hunnic standards. She told him that other Roman women had not been so fortunate. She told him that she had seen things that she could not speak of even now. What she meant by that final statement Priscus does not record, but we can imagine. We can imagine based on what other sources tell us about the fate of captive women who were given to lesser warriors, who were not treated well, who did not survive to achieve any kind of accommodation. Whether this woman's accommodation represents survival or a different kind of death is a question each viewer must answer for themselves. She lived, she bore children, she achieved a status that protected her from the worst abuses. But the woman she had been before the walls of Viminacium fell was gone forever. She had been replaced by someone else entirely, someone who no longer remembered her own language, someone whose children would grow up as Huns, someone who had been erased as surely as if she had died on the walls with her husband. The scale of what happened to Roman women during the Hunnic invasions is difficult to comprehend, even with modern archaeological evidence. In the year 2003, archaeologists excavating a site near the Danube, in what is now Hungary, discovered a mass grave containing the remains of over 400 individuals. Analysis of the bones revealed that approximately 70% were female. Further analysis revealed that many of these women showed signs of malnutrition, violence, and prolonged physical stress consistent with forced labor. Carbon dating placed the grave in the mid-5th century. The location corresponded to a known route used by the Huns to transport captives from the Balkans to their central territories. The women in this grave had not died quickly. Analysis of bone growth patterns suggested that many had lived for years in captivity before their deaths. They had been worked. They had been starved. They had been subjected to repeated physical trauma. And then they had died and been buried together in a pit that was not marked and was not meant to be found. This was one grave among hundreds that have been discovered across the former territories of the Hunnic Empire. In 1998, archaeologists working near the site of ancient Aquileia discovered evidence of mass burials dating to the mid-5th century. The remains included women and children whose bones showed signs of violent death. Some had been decapitated. Some showed evidence of burning. Some had been buried alive based on the positions of their bodies and the dirt in their lungs. These were not soldiers who had died in battle. These were civilians who had died in the aftermath. They were the ones who had not been valuable enough to take as captives. The elderly, the sick, the injured. The women who were too old or too young or too damaged to be worth the trouble of marching across the mountains. The Huns killed what they could not use, and they used what they did not kill. In 2011, genetic analysis of remains from a Hunnic period cemetery in Hungary revealed something that archaeologists had long suspected. Many of the individuals buried there showed genetic markers consistent with Mediterranean populations, Roman populations. These were people who had been born in the empire and had died in captivity. Their children and grandchildren were buried beside them, showing genetic mixing between Mediterranean and Central Asian populations. The women who had been taken from Aquileia and Naissus and Singidunum had borne children to their captors. Those children had grown up as Huns. They had married and had children of their own. They had become part of a people that their grandmothers would have considered barbarians. The bloodlines of Roman generals and tribunes and civic leaders had been absorbed into the vastness of the steppes. This was what the Huns meant when they talked about breaking bloodlines. Not simply killing the men, but taking the women and ensuring that their descendants would be Huns, not Romans. The total number of Roman women who were captured, enslaved, and subjected to the treatment I have described is impossible to determine with precision, but historians who have studied the sources estimate that during the period of Hunnic dominance from approximately 370 to 455 after Christ, hundreds of thousands of women were taken from Roman territory. Not all of them were wives of military officers, but those who were received treatment designed specifically to destroy them, and through them to destroy the morale and cohesion of the Roman military leadership. This was not random brutality, this was systematic policy. The Huns understood that Roman civilization was built on certain foundations: family honor, bloodline purity, the sacred status of Roman wives and mothers. By targeting these foundations deliberately and consistently, the Huns achieved something that mere military victory could not. They broke the will of the Roman Empire to resist. After the sack of Aquileia, the Huns moved on to destroy Padua, Verona, Brescia, Bergamo, and Milan. At each city, the pattern repeated. The walls fell. The population was processed. The families of military leaders were identified and subjected to the special treatment. Let me tell you about what happened at Milan, because Milan was different. Milan had been the capital of the Western Roman Empire until just 50 years before the Hunnic invasion. It was a city of palaces and churches and administrative buildings. It was a city where the families of the empire's highest officials lived. The garrison at Milan was commanded by a comes named Marcianus. He had served under Aetius in Gaul and had been sent to Italy to help organize the defense against the Huns. His wife was a woman named Galla, who came from one of the oldest senatorial families in Rome. They had 3 children, 2 sons and a daughter. When the Huns approached Milan, Marcianus sent his family south toward Rome, believing they would be safer there. They never arrived. The convoy they traveled with was intercepted by Hunnic scouts who had been sent ahead of the main army. Everyone in the convoy was killed or captured. Galla and her daughter were taken. Her sons were killed because they were old enough to bear arms, and the Huns had no use for Roman boys who might grow into Roman soldiers. Marcianus learned of his family's fate when the Huns displayed his wife and daughter on the walls of Milan during the siege. They wanted him to see what would happen if he continued to resist. They wanted him to know that surrender might spare his family further suffering. Marcianus did not surrender. He held the walls until they fell. He died fighting in the final assault. He never learned what happened to his wife and daughter after the city was taken. What we know is that Galla was identified as the wife of a senior Roman commander. She was given to a Hun noble of high rank, as befitting her status. Her daughter, who was 14, was given to a different noble. They were marched east with the other captives. They were never seen by any Roman witness again. By the time the Huns reached the Po River, the Roman general Aetius had still not managed to assemble a relief force. The empire was paralyzed not just by military weakness, but by the knowledge of what had happened to the families of officers who had resisted. What officer would fight to the death knowing what awaited his wife and children if he failed? This was the genius of Hunnic terror. It was not random. It was calculated to produce exactly this effect. Pope Leo I eventually met with Attila and persuaded him to withdraw from Italy. The exact terms of this negotiation are unknown, but historians believe that massive tribute payments were involved, along with threats of an Eastern Roman army that had crossed the Danube to attack the Hunnic homeland. The Huns retreated not because they had been defeated, but because they had extracted everything of value from the Italian peninsula, including its people. The retreat was almost as terrible for the captives as the advance had been. Those who had survived the march east now had to march again, carrying the spoils their captors had acquired. Those who could not keep up were left behind. Those who showed signs of weakness were beaten. Those who tried to escape were killed. And those who made it all the way back to Hunnic territory had to begin their new lives, lives that would never again be their own. Attila died the following year in 453 after Christ. According to Jordanus, he died on his wedding night from a severe hemorrhage possibly caused by excessive drinking. His new wife was a woman named Ildico, who some historians believe was herself a captive taken during the Italian campaign. If this is true, then it is possible that a woman taken from Aquileia or Milan was present when the king of the Huns died, choking on his own blood. Justice, of a sort, though not enough to matter to the thousands who had already suffered. Attila was buried in a secret location, and the workers who dug his grave were killed to prevent its discovery. The treasure buried with him was said to be enormous. Gold and silver and precious objects taken from 100 cities across Europe, but also the less tangible treasures, the broken bloodlines, the corrupted lineages, the women who would never return home. After Attila's death, the Hunnic Empire rapidly fragmented. His sons fought among themselves for the throne. Subject peoples who had been held in check by Attila's iron will saw their opportunity and revolted. The Gepids under their king Ardaric rose first, followed by the Ostrogoths and others. Within a generation, the Huns had disappeared from history as a coherent political force. The great camps on the Hungarian plain emptied. The warriors dispersed. The empire that had terrorized 2 continents for a century simply ceased to exist. But the women they had taken did not return. Some had died in captivity. Some had been sold to slave traders and dispersed across the known world. Some had been absorbed into the peoples who succeeded the Huns in the Central European plains. Some had borne children who grew up knowing nothing of their Roman heritage. The wife and surviving daughter of Tribune Gaius Petronius Marcellus were never heard from again. Their names appear in no later records. Their fates can only be imagined based on what we know happened to women in similar circumstances. What we know is this: they did not die quickly. The Huns had no interest in killing valuable captives. They died slowly over years or decades of servitude, or they survived and were transformed into something unrecognizable, something that could never return to the world they had known. This was what the Huns did to the wives of Roman generals. This was why Tribune Marcellus told his wife that death was preferable to capture. This was the unspeakable truth that Roman historians recorded in fragments too disturbing for most modern sources to discuss. The question this raises is uncomfortable but necessary. How should we remember these women? Should we remember them as victims whose suffering was beyond their control? Should we remember them as survivors who endured circumstances that would break most people? Should we remember them at all, given that their names and individual stories have been largely lost to history? I believe we should remember them. I believe their suffering matters not just as historical fact, but as a reminder of what human beings are capable of doing to each other when all restraints are removed. I believe that forgetting them would be a final betrayal added to all the betrayals they already endured. The Huns are gone. The Roman Empire is gone. But the patterns of behavior that made the suffering of these women possible are not gone. They recur throughout history whenever a conquering force seeks to break the will of the conquered by targeting their families. The systematic targeting of elite women during conquest was not invented by the Huns, and it did not end with them. We see it in medieval Europe during the Viking raids. We see it during the Mongol conquests. We see it in conflicts that have occurred within living memory. The methods change. The technology changes. The justifications change. But the fundamental logic remains the same. If you want to break a people completely, you do not simply defeat their armies. You destroy their families. You corrupt their bloodlines. You ensure that the survivors carry the trauma of what happened across generations. This is what the Huns understood. This is what they practiced with systematic efficiency. This is what they did to the wives of Roman generals. The wives of Roman generals did not choose their fate. They did not choose to be born into families of military leadership. They did not choose to be married to men who defended the empire. They did not choose to be present when the walls fell. What happened to them was not their fault, but it happened. And we should know that it happened, because knowing is how we honor their memory. Knowing is how we ensure that their suffering was not entirely in vain. If you found this video valuable, please consider subscribing and sharing it with others who are interested in the darker chapters of history that mainstream sources prefer to ignore. These stories deserve to be told. These women deserve to be remembered. What do you think? Should we continue to explore topics like this? Let me know in the comments below. And if you want to learn more about the fall of the Roman Empire and the barbarian invasions that destroyed it, check out our video on what happened to the last Roman emperor. The link is in the description. Until next time, remember that history is not just about kings and battles. It is about ordinary people caught up in extraordinary circumstances. It is about the wives and daughters who paid the price for the decisions of men who often did not survive to witness the consequences. Aurelia Marcella paid that price. Her daughters paid that price. Thousands of women whose names we will never know paid that price. Let me tell you one more story before I close. The story of a woman whose name we actually know because she was eventually ransomed back to Roman territory. Her name was Anastasia. She was the wife of a tribune named Valerius, who had commanded a section of the Aquileia garrison. Unlike most of the women taken from Aquileia, she was eventually recovered. Her family paid an enormous ransom in gold to secure her release. She was returned to Roman territory 3 years after her capture. But the Anastasia who returned was not the Anastasia who had been taken. She could not speak of what had happened to her. She could not bear to be touched by her husband. She could not look at her surviving family without weeping. She had been so broken by her experiences that she took her own life within a year of her return. Her husband Valerius recorded her story in a letter to a friend. He wrote that she had been subjected to treatment that no Roman woman should ever have to endure. He wrote that her captors had used her in ways designed to ensure she could never return to normal life. He wrote that they had succeeded. The letter survives because the friend preserved it. He preserved it because he wanted future generations to know what had happened. He wanted them to understand what the Huns had done to Roman women. He wanted them to remember. We should remember. We should not forget them.